We begin this episode by looking at the backend test that we initially created. Since we moved to Vue.js components and Pinia stores on the client side, we have some rework to do. Let's start with this test. Since the list of habits now comes from a separate API request, we don't need to assert for it anymore. All we care about is that we can see the page. We won't be needing these habits up here either. Next, create a test to make sure that we can actually fetch the list of habits. We are working backwards this time around, since we already have the code in the Habits API controller. We are using a JSON resource to return the list of habits. In order to test this, first we create the habits like this. Create a resource instance passing the habits collection. And create a response object that will give context to the JSON response we are going to create in a second. Now let's use getJSON to request the list of habits. And finally, assert that we have the correct JSON structure in the response. For this, we can use the resource response method, which creates a new response object using the context we created earlier. And on this, we can call the getData method, passing true to get an associative array instead of a generic object. If we test, everything passes because the code is already in place. To give you an idea of what this line returns, let's copy this and use dd to dump the results. As you can see, we get the habits wrapped inside the data array. Moving on, let's look at this next test for creating a habit. First, use post.json instead of post and change the URL to API habits. We no longer need to redirect, so let's remove that and instead let's assert a status code of 200. This will fail because the route doesn't exist. And it does. What we can do to save time is take the store method from the habits controller class, which we had previously tested, and paste it inside the habits API controller class. Don't forget to import the store habit request class. Instead of redirecting, let's just return an empty array for now. Oh, and let's not forget to add the route as well. Great! Now I want to make sure that I get the entire list of habits after a new habit has been created. This will allow me to easily refresh the client side with the new data. Let's borrow the arrange part from the previous test, plus this resource and request from this other test. Copy the act part from the previous test, as well as the assertion part from here. Let's also borrow this other assertion from here and paste it here. And we need to move the resource creation down to here because the new habit won't be available in the database until after the post call. Now let's use the habit resource to return a collection. We can just copy this line from the index method. Perfect. Let's move on to the next one. Just like before, we need a request for context. Take the URL from down here and paste it in the request context. Change the method to put and the URL to API habits. Change this method to put.json and the URL to API habits as well. Let's borrow the resource creation line from the previous test. Assert for a 200 status code instead of a redirect and move it below the database has assertion. The reason I do this is because after the status code assertion, I will then check the JSON response, and I want to make sure that the database has the correct data before asserting the JSON structure. And this fails as expected due to the non-existent route, so let's add it real quick. Now add the method to the controller. Again, to save time, I'll copy the method from the habits controller class. Import the update habit request class and return a collection like we did before. And we're good. Moving on to the next test. In case you don't remember, we used a data provider to run validation errors for the habit creation. This will run once for each of the validations we return in the data provider, which are these down here. And the first parameter is the name of the missing field we are testing at the time. So the first thing we need to do is change this call to post.json and set the URL to API habits. As soon as we do that, this assertion will no longer work because instead of flashing the validation errors to the session, Laravel will return them in JSON format. Thankfully, we have a handy assertion method called assert JSON validation errors. And this behaves exactly like the assert session has errors method, but with JSON responses. And now it works as expected. Let's do the next one, which is very similar. Same as before, we change the method, the URL, and the assertion. Okay, good. Now the last test. Change the method to delete.json and the URL to API habits. Create a delete request with this same URL. Assert for a status of 200 and move it below the database assertion. One line above it, create a new resource like we did before. And finally, assert that we have the proper JSON response. Let's create a new route. Add the method to the controller. Again, copying it from the old controller to save time and returning a resource collection. And we are back to green. Excellent. But you might have noticed that the habits controller has a bunch of code that we are not using anymore. So let's remove it. All we need is the index method. Nothing broke, which is good. And let's also remove the routes we don't need from the web.php file. Excellent. Now that the backend tests have been reworked, let's rework our Vue components to start making use of the opinion store we created in the last episode. there's actually just one component that needs rework. Currently, the execute button component is using an internal function to increment the executions. What we really want is to use the new execution method from the PNES store instead. Since we already tested this method in the habit store test, we don't really need to test it again in the execution button test. What we can do is simplify this component and just emit an event to the parent, which is the habits component, and call the new execution method from there. So let's remove all of this, make this test asynchronous, and here we just want to trigger a click event on the button and wait for the results. And for the assertion, we just want to make sure the correct event was emitted. Open the execute button component, remove everything from here, and just add a click event where we emit the new execution event. Let's give this a try. Start a Vite server if you don't have one running, and visit localhost habits. We should have a few already created from the last video. If I click the button, nothing happens. This is because we are still not handling the new execution event. To make this work, let's go back to the habits component and handle the new execution event like this. Now, when we press the button, it increments the count as expected. But there is a problem. I can keep clicking the button and it will go beyond the allowed times per day. So let's fix that real quick. I'll add a new test to the habit store test file. Let's call it keeps the executions less than or equal 2 times per day. And for this, maybe we can just copy these 2 lines from this test, paste them here, change the executions count to 3, and then call habits new execution. And for the assertion, we can copy this line, paste it here, and we want the executions count to be 3. Now let's add a check to make sure the executions count is lower than times per day before incrementing it. And if I try this again in the browser, it works as expected. Perfect. In the next video, we will create the client-side UI elements and code to add, update, and delete habits. See you in the next one.